For 56 years, a Derbyshire miner seemed to have vanished after stepping outside a village pub. Then, a field just a few miles away finally revealed the truth. This is the haunting true story of Alfred Swinscoe. Some disappearances begin with panic. Others begin so quietly that no one understands what they have witnessed until the moment has already passed. A familiar face leaves a room, a door closes, and life continues for everyone else. Only later does that ordinary movement become the final confirmed trace of a human being. In late January of 1967, 54-year-old Alfred Swinscoe was drinking at the Miners' Arms in Pinxton, Derbyshire. He was with friends and two of his sons. At around 10:30 that night, he handed his son Gary money for another round of drinks, then stepped outside to use the pub's external toilet. He never came back. For the next 56 years, Alfred's family had no confirmed explanation for his disappearance. There was no identified body, no known crime scene, and no public account of what had happened after he walked out of the pub. Then, in 2023, human remains were uncovered beneath farmland only a few miles away. The discovery finally revealed Alfred's fate, but it also exposed a murder that had remained hidden for more than half a century. Pinxton was a small mining village near the border of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. In the 1960s, the local coal industry shaped much of daily life. Work, family, and social routines often centered around the pits and the pubs where miners gathered after their shifts. Alfred had spent most of his working life in that world. He began working at Langton Colliery at the age of 14. He later worked as a cutter, operating machinery that removed large sections of coal from the face so other miners could break it down and move it. It was demanding work carried out in an environment where trust between workers could mean survival. His family described him as hard-working and respected. He was a father of 6, known to friends and relatives by the nickname Sparrow. Outside the mine, Alfred was widely associated with pigeon racing. He became known locally as the champion pigeon man of Pinxton, and his son Gary shared the same interest. Family accounts later described pigeon racing as a bond between father and son. By the time Alfred disappeared, he had built a life deeply connected to the local community. He was not an unknown traveler passing through the area. He had worked locally for decades, raised a family, and spent time in places where people knew his face. That made what happened at the Miners' Arms even harder to understand. The exact date of Alfred's final movements remains disputed in public records. Earlier police releases and the later inquest referred to January 20th, 1967 as the most reliable dated sighting connected to his final days. A police release from August of 2024 referred instead to January 27th. Because of that conflict, the most accurate description is that Alfred vanished in late January of 1967. The Miners' Arms stood on Church Street West in Pinxton and was a familiar meeting place for the local mining community. On the night Alfred disappeared, police believe he was drinking there with friends and two of his sons. Nothing publicly available describes a major disturbance inside the pub. There is no confirmed report of a fight, a loud argument, or a warning that Alfred was in danger. At around 10:30, Alfred gave Gary money to buy another round. He then went outside, saying he was going to use the external toilet. That brief exchange became the last known interaction between father and son. Alfred did not return to the table. He did not come home, and no later sighting has been publicly confirmed. The suddenness of his disappearance left the family with almost nothing to follow. He had not announced plans to leave. He had not collected belongings in any publicly documented way. He had simply stepped outside during an ordinary evening and vanished. At first, his family hoped he would return. Alfred's daughter later recalled how the mystery stayed with them for years. They did not know where he had gone, and without evidence of a crime, the family was left between hope and fear. Gary carried a particularly painful connection to the case because he had been present during his father's final known moments. Alfred's grandson, Russell Lowbridge, later said that Gary had been tormented by the disappearance. In 1969, Gary reportedly contacted the Salvation Army in an effort to trace his father, but the search produced no answer. Years became decades. Alfred's children grew older. Grandchildren came to know him through family memories rather than personal experience. The Alfred's Miners Arms eventually closed and was converted into a private home. The village changed, witnesses died, and whatever evidence may once have existed disappeared with time. Then, on April 26, 2023, excavation work was being carried out on farmland near Coxmoor Road in Sutton-in-Ashfield, Nottinghamshire. During the digging, human bones were uncovered several feet below the surface. Police opened an investigation into the unidentified remains. The burial depth, reported as roughly 4 to 6 feet, suggested deliberate concealment. Items found with the bones, including socks and a shoe, were shown during a public appeal. Russell Lowbridge saw the appeal and wondered whether the remains could belong to his grandfather. Russell had been only 4 years old when Alfred disappeared, but the clothing details and the location were enough for him to contact police. DNA samples were taken from Russell and from one of Alfred's surviving sons. Those samples were compared with DNA recovered from the remains. On May 28, 2023, analysis provided extremely strong support that the deceased was Alfred Swinscoe. Nottinghamshire police announced the identification publicly on June 8. For Alfred's family, the discovery ended one form of uncertainty. They now knew where he had been found. But the forensic examination made clear that this was not a natural death and not an accident. Alfred had suffered a significant stab injury. There was also evidence of blunt force trauma to parts of his body. His hand had been broken, an injury police said may have occurred while he was trying to defend himself from an attacker or attackers. At the later inquest, evidence also referred to multiple traumatic injuries, including injuries around his neck. The remains told investigators that Alfred had been subjected to sustained violence. Yet the field at Coxmoor Road may not have been the place where the attack happened. Some of Alfred's bones were missing from the burial site. Experts concluded that he was highly likely to have been killed somewhere else and moved to the field later. Archaeological findings presented at the inquest suggested that his body may have even been buried at more than one location. That possibility created a far more complex investigation. Detectives were no longer looking only for the person who attacked Alfred. They also had to consider who could have transported and concealed his body, who had access to the burial location, and whether more than one person had been involved. Police said the killer or killers would have used a vehicle to reach the Coxmoor site. That detail carried particular weight because relatively few people in the Pinxton community had access to a car in 1967. A vehicle could have narrowed the number of people capable of moving a body from one location to another without immediately attracting attention. The modern investigation faced an enormous disadvantage. More than 5 decades had passed. Potential witnesses were elderly or dead. Memories could no longer be tested with the same confidence as they might have been in the days after the disappearance. Physical evidence from the original scene, wherever that scene was, had almost certainly been lost. Detectives interviewed people who had known Alfred in an attempt to reconstruct his life, relationships, and movements. They reviewed the limited information available from 1967 and examined old work records. In October of 2023, the case was featured on BBC Crime Watch Live, and police appealed directly to anyone who had lived in Pinxton at the time. The appeal focused on details that might once have seemed unremarkable: a car seen in the wrong place, a person behaving differently after Alfred vanished, knowledge of the Coxmoor farmland, a memory that had never been shared because no one had understood its value. By August of 2024, police announced that they had identified 2 potential suspects. Both men were already dead. The wording was careful. They were described as potential suspects, not convicted offenders. Their names were not released, no complete case against them was made public, and no trial could take place. Investigators did not announce a confirmed motive or explain the suspected role of either man. That development gave the family a possible direction, but not the full truth. No one could question the men, challenge their accounts, or test the evidence before a jury. The passage of time had not only damaged the investigation, it had removed the possibility of a conventional legal ending. On November 18, 2024, an inquest was held at Nottingham Coroner's Court. Assistant Coroner Nathaniel Hartley concluded that Alfred had been unlawfully killed. The inquest heard evidence that Alfred had suffered a sustained attack involving a bladed instrument, along with other traumatic injuries. It also heard that the most reliable, specifically dated sighting was at his workplace on January 20, 1967. The court could determine that Alfred had been killed, but it could not identify who was responsible. For the family, the ruling formally replaced decades of uncertainty with a confirmed truth. Alfred had not simply disappeared into another life. He had died through violence, and someone had taken deliberate steps to hide his remains. Alfred was finally buried in January of 2024, alongside his son Gary in Sutton in Ashfield. Gary had died in November of 2012, more than a decade before the remains were identified. He never heard the inquest confirm what had happened to his father. Russell later said the case had haunted the family for decades. He described how Alfred's death had deprived later generations of a grandfather and great-grandfather. Alfred's daughter spoke about the shock of learning that her father had spent so many years buried in a field, while the family continued to wonder where he had gone. The evidence now establishes several facts. Alfred left the Miners' Arms in late January of 1967. He suffered a violent attack involving a bladed weapon and blunt force. His body was concealed, probably moved, and eventually buried near Coxmoor Road. 2 potential suspects were identified many years later, but both had died before they could face questioning or prosecution. What remains unknown is just as significant. Investigators have not publicly established the original crime scene, the motive, the exact time of death, or the full sequence that led from the pub to the burial site. They have not revealed the names of the suspects or the evidence connecting them to Alfred. The discovery of Alfred's remains solved the oldest part of the mystery. It gave his family a grave, a formal finding, and proof that he had not simply chosen to disappear. But the person or people responsible escaped public accountability. A murder can remain hidden because evidence is destroyed. It can remain hidden because witnesses stay silent. Sometimes it survives as a secret only because time removes everyone who could explain it. In Alfred Swinscoe's case, the ground eventually revealed what had been concealed. It returned his name to his family and transformed a missing person mystery into a confirmed unlawful killing. But it could not answer the final question: who attacked Alfred after he left the Miners' Arms, and how did they keep the truth buried for more than 50 years?